December 7th, 1941, 7:55 in the morning, Hawaiian time. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida circled his Nakajima bomber 3,000 meters above Oahu's northern coast, squinting through morning clouds at what should have been the greatest victory in naval history. Below him, Pearl Harbor stretched like a strategic board game made real, with battleships moored in neat rows along Ford Island. They believed every major American carrier would be there, sitting ducks in the harbor, waiting to be destroyed in a single devastating blow that would secure Japanese dominance across the Pacific for years to come. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Fuchida and the dozens of intelligence officers who planned this operation did not know, what they could not have known despite months of meticulous surveillance, was that their intelligence network had failed them at the most critical moment in their nation's history. The American carriers were not where they were supposed to be, and this single miscalculation would transform what should have been a complete strategic victory into the beginning of Japan's eventual defeat. 6 months earlier, in a nondescript building in Tokyo, Lieutenant Commander Takeo Yoshikawa had received his orders. 30 years old, brilliant, and possessing an almost photographic memory for ship movements and naval architecture, Yoshikawa was about to become Japan's most important intelligence asset in Hawaii. His mission was deceptively simple: watch Pearl Harbor, count the ships, and report everything back to Tokyo. The Imperial Japanese Navy needed precise information about American fleet movements, and Yoshikawa was their man on the ground. Yoshikawa arrived in Honolulu in March 1941 under the cover name Tadashi Morimura, posing as a junior diplomat at the Japanese consulate. He had no formal espionage training, carried no secret codes or invisible ink, and never attempted to recruit agents or build a spy network. His weapon was simpler and more effective: patience and observation. Every morning, he would drive the winding road up to the Shuncho Row Tea House on Alewa Heights, where the view of Pearl Harbor spread out below like a tactical map. Through binoculars, he counted ships, noted their positions, and memorized their movements. The routine became almost meditative. Yoshikawa learned to distinguish between battleships and cruisers from miles away, recognizing each vessel by its silhouette and superstructure. He took scenic flights over the islands, booked through tourist agencies, using a camera to document the harbor from above. He went swimming at public beaches near naval installations, floating on his back and counting vessels while appearing to sunbathe. He befriended workers at the naval yard, buying them drinks and casually asking about ship schedules. In 6 months of operation, he filed over 70 reports to Tokyo, each one meticulously detailing the locations and movements of American warships. But there was a problem that Yoshikawa himself did not fully understand until much later. The American carriers, the Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, moved constantly. Unlike the predictable battleships that spent weeks at anchor undergoing maintenance and crew rotation, the carriers operated on irregular schedules. They would depart for training exercises with little notice, disappear for days or weeks, and return at unpredictable intervals. Yoshikawa reported these movements faithfully, but intelligence officers in Tokyo began to see patterns where none existed. Captain Kanji Ogawa, Chief of Intelligence for the Combined Fleet, sat in his office in late November reviewing months of surveillance reports. A career naval officer with 2 decades of experience in strategic planning, Ogawa had built his reputation on pattern recognition and predictive analysis. As he studied Yoshikawa's reports, he became convinced he had identified the American carrier rotation schedule. The Enterprise typically returned to Pearl Harbor on Friday evenings or Saturday mornings. The Lexington followed a similar pattern, usually arriving mid-week after training exercises. The Saratoga, currently on the West Coast undergoing maintenance, would not be a factor in December. Ogawa's analysis seemed solid. American naval officers were creatures of habit, he reasoned. They preferred weekend liberty for their crews, which meant carriers would be in port on Sundays whenever possible. He drafted a memorandum to Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Combined Fleet, expressing confidence that at least 2 and possibly all 3 carriers would be present at Pearl Harbor on Sunday, December 7th. Yamamoto, a brilliant strategist who had himself expressed doubts about the wisdom of attacking America, accepted Ogawa's assessment. The operation would proceed as planned. On the American side of the Pacific, completely unaware of Japanese surveillance, Admiral Husband Kimmel commanded the Pacific Fleet from his headquarters overlooking Pearl Harbor. 59 years old, Kimmel had taken command in February 1941, replacing Admiral James Richardson, who had been relieved after protesting the decision to base the fleet in Hawaii. Kimmel was a battleship admiral, a product of the Naval War College's doctrine that saw capital ships as the decisive weapons of naval warfare. He respected carriers and understood their growing importance, but his strategic thinking remained rooted in the belief that battleships would ultimately decide any major engagement. This bias influenced his operational decisions in ways he did not fully recognize. When Admiral William Halsey requested permission to take the Enterprise on a training mission to deliver Marine Corps aircraft to Wake Island, Kimmel approved without hesitation. When Admiral John Newton proposed taking the Lexington on a similar mission to Midway Atoll, Kimmel again agreed. These were routine training exercises, opportunities for carrier crews to practice long-range navigation and flight operations. The battleships would remain in Pearl Harbor, where their presence would deter any potential Japanese aggression. It was sound strategic thinking based on conventional wisdom that had guided naval doctrine for decades. Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, Kimmel's intelligence officer, sat in his cramped office reviewing radio intercepts and diplomatic cables. 38 years old, fluent in Japanese, and one of the Navy's foremost experts on Japanese naval capabilities, Layton had been warning for months that tensions with Japan were approaching a breaking point. He tracked Japanese fleet movements through radio traffic analysis, noting with growing concern that several carrier divisions had gone radio silent in mid-November. This was significant because Japanese carriers, like all warships, maintained regular radio communications for coordination and safety. When they went silent, it usually meant they were preparing for operations. Layton brought his concerns to Kimmel on December 2nd. The Admiral listened patiently as his intelligence officer outlined the evidence: missing carrier divisions, increased diplomatic traffic between Tokyo and Washington, reports of Japanese military buildups in Southeast Asia. Kimmel asked the obvious question: where were the Japanese carriers? Layton admitted he did not know. They could be in Japanese home waters, preparing for operations in Southeast Asia, or possibly moving toward American positions in the Philippines. The one place Layton did not seriously consider was Hawaii. The distance was too great, the logistics too complex, and the strategic value too uncertain. Pearl Harbor felt safe, protected by thousands of miles of empty ocean. On the morning of November 26th, the Japanese strike force departed from Hitokapu Bay in the Kuril Islands. 6 carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, steamed into the North Pacific, accompanied by 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, and 8 tankers. It was the most powerful naval task force ever assembled by Japan, carrying over 400 aircraft and more than 10,000 men. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the force from the bridge of the Akagi, following a northern route that would keep them far from commercial shipping lanes and minimize the chance of detection. The fleet maintained absolute radio silence. Sailors were forbidden from sending personal messages or operational communications. Navigation was conducted using celestial observation and dead reckoning. Refueling operations were performed in rough seas, with tankers pulling alongside carriers, while both ships maintained radio silence and minimal lighting. It was a masterpiece of operational security, and it worked perfectly. American intelligence detected nothing unusual. Radio traffic analysis suggested Japanese carriers remained near their home bases, exactly where Layton expected them to be. Aboard the Akagi, Commander Fuchida prepared his pilots for the attack. 40 years old, with 15 years of flying experience and a reputation as one of Japan's finest aviators, Fuchida had been personally selected by Admiral Yamamoto to lead the airstrike. He drilled his pilots relentlessly during the voyage, reviewing attack procedures and target priorities. The primary targets were the American carriers, followed by battleships, cruisers, and shore installations. Fuchida emphasized the importance of finding and destroying the carriers in the initial strike. Without their carriers, American naval power in the Pacific would be crippled for at least a year, possibly longer. Intelligence briefings during the voyage relied on Yoshikawa's most recent reports, transmitted from Honolulu to Tokyo and then relayed to the strike force via coded messages. On December 2nd, Yoshikawa reported that no carriers were currently in Pearl Harbor. This was concerning but not unexpected. On December 4th, he reported that the Enterprise and Lexington remained absent, but intelligence analysts in Tokyo assured Nagumo that both carriers would likely return before Sunday. The reports continued, each one transmitted through diplomatic channels to avoid detection by American codebreakers. The final intelligence update reached the strike force on December 6th. Yoshikawa's message was brief and devastating: no carriers present in Pearl Harbor. 8 battleships were moored along Battleship Row, along with numerous cruisers, destroyers, and support vessels, but the carriers were gone. Nagumo convened an emergency meeting with his senior officers to discuss the implications. Some argued for postponing the attack until the carriers returned. Others suggested proceeding anyway, reasoning that destroying the battleships would still be a significant victory and that the carriers could be hunted down later. Captain Minoru Genda, the brilliant tactician who had helped plan the operation, argued most forcefully for proceeding. They had achieved complete surprise, he reasoned. The American fleet was unprepared, with many crews on weekend liberty and defensive measures relaxed. Even without the carriers, destroying the battleships would eliminate American offensive capability in the Pacific for months. Nagumo listened to the arguments, considered the risks, and made his decision. The attack would proceed as planned. They would destroy what was available and deal with the carriers later. What none of the Japanese commanders knew, what their intelligence network had failed to determine despite months of surveillance, was not just where the carriers were, but why they were gone. The Enterprise was 800 kilometers west of Pearl Harbor, returning from Wake Island after encountering bad weather that delayed her schedule. She was due back on Saturday, but rough seas pushed her arrival to Sunday morning. The Lexington was approaching Midway Atoll, over 2,000 kilometers northwest of Hawaii, on her training mission. The Saratoga was in San Diego, undergoing maintenance and scheduled to depart for Hawaii on December 8th. The carriers were not absent because of some brilliant American strategic decision or because someone had detected Japanese preparations. They were gone because of routine training schedules, maintenance requirements, and bad weather. It was luck, pure and simple, though some would later call it providence. At 0600 on December 7th, the first wave of Japanese aircraft launched from the carrier decks. Fuchida led 183 planes, including torpedo bombers, dive bombers, horizontal bombers, and fighters, climbing into the pre-dawn darkness and forming up over the fleet. The second wave, another 167 aircraft, would launch an hour later. As Fuchida's formation flew south toward Oahu, he radioed the coded message confirming they had achieved complete surprise. The transmission was simple, elegant, and would become one of the most famous in military history: Tora, Tora, Tora. The attack unfolded with devastating efficiency. Torpedo bombers swept in low across the harbor, releasing their weapons against the moored battleships. Dive bombers screamed down from above, dropping armor-piercing bombs converted from 16-inch naval shells. Horizontal bombers attacked from medium altitude, targeting oil storage facilities and airfields. Within 30 minutes, the pride of the American Pacific Fleet was in ruins. The Arizona exploded and sank, taking over 1,000 men with her. The Oklahoma capsized. The California, Nevada, and West Virginia settled into the mud. The Maryland, Tennessee, and Pennsylvania sustained significant damage. Over 2,400 Americans were lost, and more than 1,000 were wounded. But as Fuchida circled over the burning harbor, looking for the targets that mattered most, he experienced a sinking realization that no amount of tactical success could overcome. The carrier berths were empty. Not a single American carrier was present. He radioed the Akagi, reporting the absence and requesting instructions. Should he redirect planes to attack shore installations more heavily? Should he prepare for a third wave targeting oil storage and repair facilities? Nagumo, mindful of the missing carriers and concerned they might counterattack his fleet, ordered the strike force to withdraw. They had achieved a great victory, destroying or damaging 8 battleships, but they had missed their primary targets. The news reached Tokyo within hours. Admiral Yamamoto received the report in his cabin aboard the battleship Nagato, reading the detailed damage assessments with a mixture of satisfaction and deep concern. The battleship losses were significant, but Yamamoto, unlike many of his colleagues, understood that carriers were the future of naval warfare. He had studied naval aviation for decades, had fought bureaucratic battles to expand Japan's carrier force, and had personally designed the Pearl Harbor operation around the principle that destroying American carriers was essential for victory. The operation had succeeded tactically, but failed strategically. Captain Ogawa, the intelligence officer who had confidently predicted carrier presence at Pearl Harbor, found himself facing uncomfortable questions from senior commanders. How had the intelligence been so wrong? Where were the carriers? Why had surveillance not detected their departure? Ogawa reviewed Yoshikawa's reports, trying to understand where his analysis had failed. The patterns he thought he had identified turned out to be illusions, random coincidences interpreted as meaningful data. The carriers had no predictable schedule because operational requirements and weather conditions created too many variables. His confidence in pattern analysis had blinded him to the fundamental uncertainty of naval movements. In Washington, news of the attack reached President Franklin Roosevelt at 1:40 in the afternoon Eastern Time. The initial reports were confused and fragmentary, but within hours the scale of the disaster became clear. Roosevelt immediately ordered a full investigation into the intelligence failure that had allowed the attack to succeed. How had the Japanese fleet crossed thousands of kilometers of ocean undetected? Why were defensive measures inadequate? What had gone wrong with intelligence assessments that should have predicted the attack? But even as Roosevelt and his military commanders grappled with these questions, they began to understand that the Japanese had made a critical error. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, studied the damage reports and noted what was missing. All 3 carriers had survived. The Enterprise would arrive at Pearl Harbor on Sunday evening to find the harbor burning and the fleet devastated. The Lexington would return days later. The Saratoga would arrive from San Diego before the end of December. America had lost battleships, but her carrier force remained intact. Commander Layton, Kimmel's intelligence officer, spent the days after the attack reconstructing Japanese movements and trying to understand how his analysis had missed the warning signs. He reviewed radio intercepts, diplomatic cables, and intelligence reports from the previous months. The evidence had been there, he realized, but scattered and ambiguous. Japanese carriers going radio silent was significant, but it could have meant many things. Increased diplomatic traffic suggested crisis, but not necessarily attack on Hawaii. The pattern only became clear in retrospect, when all the pieces could be assembled with the benefit of hindsight. The strategic implications became apparent within weeks. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who replaced Kimmel as commander of the Pacific Fleet, arrived in Hawaii on Christmas Day and immediately assessed available assets. The battleship losses were severe, but most of the ships that sank in the shallow harbor could be raised and repaired. More importantly, the carrier force was intact and ready for operations. Oil storage facilities were undamaged, repair facilities were operational, the harbor itself remained functional. Japan had achieved tactical surprise, but failed to deliver a decisive strategic blow. In Japan, the initial euphoria over Pearl Harbor's success gave way to more sober assessment. Yamamoto, always more pessimistic than his colleagues about the prospects for victory against America, began planning for a prolonged campaign. The missing carriers troubled him deeply. They were out there somewhere, probably being reinforced and preparing for offensive operations. Japan would need to find and destroy them quickly before American industrial capacity could overwhelm Japanese advantages in training and experience. This concern drove Japanese strategy in the following months. Yamamoto planned operations designed to draw out American carriers and destroy them in decisive battles. The attack on Midway Atoll in June 1942 was specifically designed for this purpose. Seize the island and force the American carriers to respond, then destroy them in battle. But intelligence failures continued to plague Japanese operations. They underestimated American code-breaking capabilities, which gave Nimitz detailed knowledge of Japanese plans. They underestimated American carrier effectiveness, assuming their superior pilot training would offset numerical disadvantages. Most critically, they failed to understand that the carriers they had missed at Pearl Harbor represented the core of American striking power in the Pacific. The Battle of Midway, fought 6 months after Pearl Harbor, demonstrated the consequences of the December 7th intelligence failure. 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Yorktown, and Hornet, faced 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Through a combination of intelligence advantage, tactical skill, and considerable luck, American dive bombers caught the Japanese carriers vulnerable and destroyed all 4 in a single day. The Akagi, Nagumo's flagship at Pearl Harbor, sank with her commander watching from a nearby destroyer. The Japanese carriers that had led the Pearl Harbor attack were gone, and with them went Japanese offensive capability in the Pacific. Yoshikawa, the spy whose reports had shaped Japanese planning for Pearl Harbor, continued his intelligence work in Hawaii until August 1942, when he was exchanged along with other diplomatic personnel. He returned to Japan as a hero, celebrated for his role in the Pearl Harbor operation, but he carried with him the knowledge that his reports, accurate as they were, had failed to provide the critical information that might have changed history. He had counted ships meticulously, noted their movements precisely, and transmitted everything faithfully, but he had not understood the implications of what he was observing. The carriers were the war, and they had slipped through his surveillance at the crucial moment. In the decades after the conflict, historians debated whether the missing carriers at Pearl Harbor represented luck, providence, or some element of both. Some argued that American intelligence had detected Japanese preparations and deliberately moved the carriers to safety. This theory collapsed under examination. American intelligence had failed completely to detect the Japanese strike force or predict the attack. The carriers were absent for routine operational reasons that had nothing to do with Japanese threats. Others suggested that Admiral Kimmel's decision to send the carriers on training missions reflected some unconscious strategic wisdom that recognized their importance. This too seemed unlikely. Kimmel was a battleship admiral who approved carrier deployments because they were routine training exercises, not because he anticipated attack. The most likely explanation was simpler and more disturbing for both sides. Japan missed the carriers through a combination of intelligence failure and bad luck. Yoshikawa's surveillance, thorough as it was, could not predict the unpredictable. American carriers operated on schedules determined by weather, mechanical requirements, and training opportunities, none of which followed recognizable patterns. Japanese intelligence analysts saw patterns where none existed, convincing themselves that American carriers would be present when they needed them to be. It was wishful thinking elevated to strategic assessment, and it cost Japan the war. For America, the survival of the carriers represented the thin margin between disaster and catastrophe. If Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga had been at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, they almost certainly would have been located and attacked. Japanese pilots were specifically trained to identify and prioritize carriers. With all 3 carriers destroyed or damaged, American offensive capability in the Pacific would have been eliminated for at least a year, possibly longer. Japan would have had free rein across the Pacific, while America rebuilt her carrier force. The strategic calculus of the entire conflict would have changed. Commander Fuchida, who led the Pearl Harbor attack and survived the entire conflict, spent his post-war years reflecting on what happened that December morning. He wrote extensively about the operation, always returning to the absence of the carriers as the critical failure. In his memoirs, he described circling over Pearl Harbor and searching desperately for the distinctive silhouettes of American carriers, knowing even as he directed attacks against battleships that the wrong targets were burning below. The battleships represented the past, he wrote. The carriers were the future. Japan destroyed the past at Pearl Harbor, but missed the future entirely. The intelligence failure that allowed carriers to escape Pearl Harbor highlighted fundamental problems with Japanese intelligence collection and analysis throughout the conflict. Japanese intelligence services were fractured between army and navy organizations that rarely cooperated. Intelligence officers like Ogawa relied too heavily on pattern analysis and not enough on ground truth. Surveillance operations like Yoshikawa's, while thorough, operated in isolation without the broader context that might have revealed their limitations. Most critically, Japanese strategic planning suffered from confirmation bias. They saw what they wanted to see, interpreted ambiguous intelligence in ways that supported their operational plans, and ignored evidence that contradicted their assumptions. American intelligence, while it failed to predict Pearl Harbor, learned critical lessons from the disaster. The establishment of unified intelligence commands, better coordination between services, improved code-breaking operations, and more rigorous analysis transformed American intelligence capabilities by mid-1942. The victory at Midway was built on intelligence success as much as tactical skill. American codebreakers provided Nimitz with detailed knowledge of Japanese plans, allowing him to position his carriers perfectly. It was everything Japanese intelligence should have provided at Pearl Harbor, but failed to deliver. In the end, the day Japanese High Command realized their spies were wrong about Pearl Harbor's carriers was the day the attack succeeded. Admiral Nagumo read Fuchida's report from over the burning harbor and understood immediately that they had missed their primary targets. That realization shaped every subsequent Japanese operation in the Pacific. They spent the next 6 months trying to finish what Pearl Harbor had started, hunting American carriers across the Pacific. But the carriers they sought had been hardened by combat, reinforced by new construction, and supported by an industrial base that Japan could never match. The ships that were not at Pearl Harbor on December 7th became the instruments of Japanese defeat. Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, supposedly told colleagues after the attack that Japan had awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with terrible resolve. Whether he actually said this remains disputed, but the sentiment captured the strategic reality. America's industrial capacity, given time to mobilize, would overwhelm Japanese advantages in training and experience. The only hope for Japanese victory lay in destroying American will to fight through devastating early defeats. Pearl Harbor was supposed to deliver that defeat. Instead, it became a rallying cry that unified American purpose and justified total commitment to victory. The missing carriers at Pearl Harbor represented one of history's most consequential intelligence failures, affecting both sides in different ways. For Japan, it meant their carefully planned strike missed its most important targets, leaving American offensive capability intact at the moment when it was most vulnerable. For America, it meant survival, buying time to mobilize resources and develop strategies that would eventually win the Pacific conflict. And for both sides, it demonstrated that intelligence, no matter how thorough, cannot predict everything. Sometimes history turns on weather delays, maintenance schedules, and training exercises. Sometimes the most important intelligence is not what you know, but what you failed to discover. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.